I'm so glad to be visiting with you again, brother. It's since our first conversation, I've seen those wheels spinning, and I love that. And I want to get into kind of your perception on what's happened since our first talk. And we got to meet you and your beautiful family here in Arkansas when y'all came through. Had an absolute blast. Getting to spend a couple days with y'all. So if you will, let's go into as we start discussing agriculture and those intersections between quantum biology and health and all the things that don't maybe seem to come together but matter a whole lot. What's kind of that biggest revelation that you've had since our first conversation and our in-person visit?
Gosh, I mean, it's a short time in between. Obviously, there's a lot of things, happening in life, especially with same as you, like have a family that with little kiddos, and that just is always going up and down, right? But I think certain things I've been trying to understand and hone in is trying to figure out the relationship, that part, right? Because whether that's a human relationship, the intricate connection between us as the same species, right, with a different diverse background, the culture, and I would call that biodiversity. I think that's very reasonable. And equally is that relationship with other life, right? And how do we view that as a collaborative um, approach or partnership, if we will. And I think that it's always fascinating me, right? And it's in ways where I see is like when, for example, like running business, when we have all these different changes, human resource changing direction and difficult task and project coming in, and we always experience that. But I think it's sometimes it's those relationship, who is next to you, who is behind you, and those motivation really help and to support and kind of, in my view, my personal experience is what calms me down, be able to continue to work through that. I think that's something I feel is beyond these physical science that we're experiencing and how that describe or explain things. I think that relationship is so valuable, so important, and for us as a species to kind of moving forward in the right direction.
Well, not the answer I was expecting, but I absolutely love it. I think that's an aspect of life that we probably put on the back burner as a topic or a focus is that relationship, and we're always constrained by our own experiences. And when you start seeing other people, it was so cool to see you and Betty interact, right? Like, so this cultural Chinese, growing up there, it was just so neat to see that in little old Arkansas that there's a big world out there and a lot of different cultures coming together, and then the harmony of it is beautiful. Like, I don't even know really how to explain it without, experiencing it if I ever would have understood. But it's really cool. And the relationships between everything, really, all living things, and just how different the human species is in cultural ties, but how similar that connection can be. It's just like, I don't know if I just completely rambled there, but it was such an amazing experience to, have you, John, and I walking through the farm, the pastures, your perspective on the different forbs, and then the rotation of the animals, talking about your experience with the sheep, contrasting and comparing Arizona with Arkansas, and then we're talking about all these things, but then you come back with the takeaway of how important relationships are in agriculture, because I don't think a lot of people think about that. They think of, oh, well, here's a farm that's X amount of price, it's within our budget, and we could do this, this, and this. But like, don't factor in the support system and the relationships that come with living in a certain place.
Yeah, I think going back, I think last time when we talked about all this, um, going deep into the science a little bit more, and you asked me a question about dissipated structure, right? In relation to equilibrium and balance. And I think this is all tied in, right? Because I where I see is when we're thinking about our lifetime span, right, as a human, which is quite short compared to the life that has been living on this planet for billions of years, right? From the microbial that inoculation that started, and probably the same strain of the microbes are still on this planet, and um, on the cellular level, and we're no differentiation compared to sheep, cattle, plants. And on the cellular biology, is all the same. It's a simple our body is assembly of the cells. Right? And but going back, it's like having that opportunity, what you said, the little Arkansas, and that having that Chinese connection and share that culture and value, even talking about how do you even cook this soup, what method do you use? I think that's really in ways to allow me to reconnect with my culture and value, but coming back to recognize how little we are, how short of the time span we are compared to everything surround us we have to cherish for. Um, and that going back to equilibrium and dissipative structure, right? When we think about tornado, when we think about tsunami, those are dissipative structure when the ecosystem and reach to certain threshold and it cannot hold or contain it anymore. It needs a reassembly and to reset and to calm that whole situation down. And if we're looking at that entire curve from the calming to the calming part, that is a process to reach that equilibrium, right? So, and equally, when we stretch that time into our glacial, interglacial, that timeline and period of time, and in the last million years, we've had 7 to 9 different glacial, interglacial periods. And our human part is only post last glacial maximum is 20,000 years, right? And then the climate start going into a trajectory, start warming again from the last ice age. And human race is only known for last 10, 12,000 years through these, we call it Holocene age, right? 20,000 years plus history. And we're entering into a space, if we're looking at these paleoclimates, all these glacial, interglacial uh, variations, and we're warming to that tipping point. And is inevitably we're going to hit that threshold and the climate start entering into a glacial condition, or in terms of how the climate is going to be cooling down and the earth is going to reset that process. So it's a cycle. It's a cycle. If you look at that glacial interglacial cycle, and yes, that's a very stretched, very long dissipated structure. But when that we're looking at that threshold and reset, the whole curve as a period of the process, and Earth is constantly doing these processes to maintain its equilibrium. So I think there's no differences. It's just really depending on whether we're looking at the point, we're looking at the line, we're looking at the surface, or a three-dimensional or
Yeah.
multi-dimensional. So that's where my take is just the same thing, but we're looking at from different angle. Equally similar as how when we talk about the thermodynamic and kinetic relationship, they're describing different things. They're describing, one is describing the process, the other is describing the whole chain of reaction. So it's excuse me, the rate of the reaction. So it's very different analysis, but when we combine those together, and that's what where I view is the complexity where the ecosystem provided to us, which is the most important part, I think, for us as human yet to understand, because we always trying to isolate variable, trying to decouple things, but rather to look at the system as a whole to connect everything together not be the expert of a specific point, but be a generalist to appreciate the entire process of the complexity.
Yeah. So, like, just to catch anybody up, so doesn't know what we're talking about with dissipated structures. This is Ilan Perugin. It's like I think he won the Nobel in '73, and it talks about how energy flows through and is essentially dissipated. But like what it seems to be, where I disagree with basically every field of study, is that we're always going for balance. I think we're like everything is inherently out of balance and constantly in an oscillation, right? And what we see as a balance is that middle point of the oscillation. And I think that the that homeostasis is more about this constant oscillation through energy passing through a system. So with and because all energy comes from the sun, right? Like that's kind of that focal point where we can tie in all the agriculture and biology, cancer, all of it, right? And I think that this, you hit on another aspect where we're talking about scale, right? Scale and time. This is a huge, important weave into that conversation. Jack and I, had a really good conversation on time at Jack Cruz. So what I have seen, I want to tie this into cancer. I want to get your take on bringing in agriculture. Is that when we block the flow of energy, right? We either have a decrease in the internal or the initial, or a decrease in the external, right? And so this is where it comes into like biophotons, and then I'm probably gonna like blow some minds here, but like we have to get rid of excess energy too, right? Like and we can do this through light, biophotons. And so like the when you look at the emission of, say, like your fingernails, this is one of the highest points of biophoton release, right? This is because we are a dissipative structure and the energy flowing through. So like when, and this is gonna sound crazy, but like when we paint our fingernails, right? Like women paint their fingernails and they block the biophoton emission. It's actually a really bad negative feedback loop because you're holding in the biophoton that should be released. And that is where we have to bring in this biophysics perspective within the conversation, because it sounds insignificant, right? The wearing sunglasses sounds insignificant. It's getting sunlight sounds insignificant, or having the appropriate spectrums, again, sounds insignificant. But when you put in that three-legged stool of light, water, magnetism, and you understand that we are a dissipative structure and that homeostasis or balance does not actually exist, it's in a constant flux, right? Constant flux. This is why entropy is a thing, right? And even reverse entropy. It's like when you understand those probabilities and how things are a dissipative structure and entropy, you bring it in to where everything that we think we know about health is wrong. Right. That's a really, really, really important connotation, in my opinion, because that lack of coherence within the oscillations is extremely important. And one way that we know that is with the work of Fritz Popp and Roland Van Wyck, in that cancer cells emit light biophotons chaotically and don't store that light and release it in delayed luminescence very long, versus a healthy cell. It's very coherent, right? Very, very delayed and holds this light. This is all the information, because light is information. That may sound crazy, but one more context. I'm gonna give you the floor, Yadi. Is I want you to feel like you're sitting in the middle of a movie theater, right in the dead center of the movie theater, and you're looking at the screen. Behind us, we have a projection, right? A projector. And what comes out of the projector? It's a light that comes through a screen, and then you can look straight up right above you, and you have these beams of light that you can see, right? And then on the screen, you have the picture. Okay. So when we mess up one of those layers within the coherence, the fidelity of the signal, say the light bulb on the projector goes out, you don't have the appropriate film on there, you have the lights on. You think about the movie theater, they turn the lights down, right, to increase the fidelity of that signal, right? You turn the lights down to have the appropriate room. You have to have the screen, right? The screen is where you receive the information that's in that light. And so our bodies work the exact same way. So when we throw any of that off, you don't have cohesiveness, coherence within the system, and that's where chaos arrives, and you get an aberrant effect. So that's that's such an important context, I think, in having these conversations that w- we're not a big bag of chemicals, and it's just a bunch of chemical reactions going on. The biophysics really dictate the entire being.
Wow. Well, I have to simmer that a little bit. I very much enjoy this type of conversation because I can learn so many things just through, 2 minutes dialogue, right? Um, I yeah, I think the energy distribution, well, when we think about that oscillation you talk about, that processes we talk about, we're constantly looking at, in our society, typically is, okay, if we have the reactant, what kind of products we drive to? Well, when we're looking at from the chemical reaction perspective or from anything we do in general as a society is we're looking at for a input and output, the result aspect of that. And oftentimes we ignore that process in between, how many different processes that it gone through to have that final stage of that outcome or product. I think if I understand that correctly, and you're exactly describing that same phenomenon, like in terms of how cancer cells, how our body and health well-being, and that is, how we're looking at that input and output, but ignore that we the process in between. And then similarly, I think that translate well. I'm always intrigued with this type of conversation because in less than 2 minutes, I always learn a lot. And then, if I understand what you talk about there, that cancer cell and a human wellness and health perspective, and is in relation to what we have seen today in our society, regardless of agriculture or any part of the work, it's we're always looking at having that input and to directly jump into that output, which is the product, right? And we kind of ignore the process in between there. And yes, so long as we have that result, then regardless how I get there, it doesn't matter. But it matters so much because what is the intermediate step of that reaction, chain of reaction? Maybe there's 3, 4, 5 steps to get there. But if we don't understand those processes along the way, what are other part of the side effect that evolve into there and to get that product. I think that's where the issues lays there. To jump into result right away. Now in our culture where I have seen firsthand, I think I always like to come back to this nitrogen as an example is because we are so dictated, like in a way, for producers to kind of getting into this nitrogen route, and then it's like a drug. You're taking it, you can't get away from it, and that drug and connect it to where you have to use multiple drugs to try to cure the issues that happening in between. Because nitrogen for the plant, for certain plants, a lot of plants, particularly those older variety, heirloom varieties, it doesn't really help the plants to express that epigenetic changes over time. It only acts as a patch, right? When you use that nitrogen and converting that into a main group, into those protein building process, and it takes up so much energy of that plant that the plant cannot really going back into process and then right away to think about, wow, how do I go through my second metabolism and that process and to make those things that is creating a self-defensive mechanism. So when you don't have the self-defense, your autoimmune is being cut off, and then you have those issues. Yeah, there's all these other pesticide, herbicide, fungicide has to come in to use in ways similar to our military like approach is we have to go combat. But
Mhm.
do we really need to go combat rather than we need to find an alternative way to heal? And so that is, I think, something that is always intriguing me. The result driven that with ignoring that process is happening. Another layer I think I kind of learned from what you said there is when we think about that energy distribution, right? And first thing I always think about offspring, right? And I've experienced this 3 times with my wife giving birth to babies. That energy change is so miraculous. That process is such a process that you gotta appreciate, right? But at the same time, as you see the female going through that hormonal change and then kind of change that energy distribution into the new cells that is building in her body, and then through that offspring process and continuation, that cellular translation in between the mother and the baby, through breastfeeding, through this whole process, that is just so fascinating. And but there's no difference comparing to when we talk about ruminants or other mammals going through this process, or even plants, right? And for plants, particularly, when I start the observation of looking at some of these heirloom variety of the plants, whether it's annual, right, or other native perennials, I think when looking at them through is there's always that stress factor coming in. That acute stress oftentimes provide a positive changes on energy distribution to allow that offspring process going so well. But when you prolong that too much, become oxidative stress, then you will see the alternative of that result. And that oxidative stress oftentimes coming with a misfunction of the metabolism of that plant to go through that process. So I think it's so important when we look at human ourselves, looking at the terrain ourselves, and we have to take those lessons and learn from other species because the that connection that on the cellular level, submolecular level, it's so similar. And then how we address stress for human health is indifferent than how we address those stresses for environmental changes for the other life thriving or surviving in the environment that we're living in.
I think about when we were walking through, the pasture headed down to the river, and you said that this is that stress is what creates this reproductive signal, right? I think that that's fascinating. There is a study with mice, and this is crazy, where they basically give them everything they need. They have this huge mouse colony, and then it shows how, some of the mice get super fat, and then they start changing, and then over time they become very small and infertile. And it is really that, like, I'm blanking on the name of this study, but it's been repeated multiple times to where it's almost like what we're living too. And it's that opposite of having an a oscillation in constantly having food, constantly having this almost easy lifestyle, and the results are an absolute catastrophe. And so that's it's like the flip side of what you're talking about. And I wish I was better prepared on that study, but that's the first thing that comes to mind is the mirror opposite, right? These opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. And I want to tie back that into the relationship we talked about too, because um I've heard so many people talk about it, even some studies um talk about this too, about the relationship between different species, right? For human singing to the plants or playing guitar to the plants, and people seeing all these different effects, and the plant that quote unquote have that feeling side. I I think those are very interesting lesson and observation that we should take on those, because it is really the signal translation, right? A word on on the cellular level. It is not just how do we function as logic or thoughts that process we can only allow us to understand among each other within the same speciation. Even within the same speciation, we probably can't understand because if I'm only speaking Chinese, you're speaking English, then we're gonna have a lot of cracking, incidences like we don't understand each other, right? So, but that signaling is always constantly exchanged. Certain things that we don't have to say things and we can understand, even we don't speak the same language. I think that same way can happen between us and animals. One of the closest example is our pets, particularly dogs. They understood humans so much even without speaking the same language. And I can understand my dog when he's barking, at what time he's barking, how loud he's barking, and what direction he's looking at. Be able to understand what he wants. And that is those relationships. You build those relationships through time, through trust, and we cannot ignore that fact. And with in agriculture system, if we don't ever look for the plants, don't ever look for the condition of that environmental changes, don't ever looking at for how those animals provide the signaling to us to allow us to understand what they really want rather than what we give to them. And that's where we won't have those changes. We won't have those trust. We won't build that relationship. And obviously, those biochemical changes through this signal, it's a cause and effect, won't happen. It just felt like that relationship is so important for us to be able to kind of coherently get everybody together and to be able to kind of making that complex and making that an ecosystem that we're living within.
Y- the whole relationship conversation keeps coming back to reading signals that we are not even aware of. So like, we can feel an intention, or we can feel like a demeanor. Like we've all experienced somebody walks in the room and they brighten it, or they just like bring the energy down, right? Like there's these things that we pick up on. And I was looking at this explanation on like the magnetic field produced by somebody in like a positive state versus a negative state. And I thought this was really fascinating. Like in this love or a positive state, the magnetic field was larger than that in a negative state, a negative frame of mind. And that's very interesting in kind of that context we've been talking about, but also like it's why it's different having a Zoom type meeting versus being face to face. You're actually for lack of a better term, sampling somebody else's biophotons, right? Like there's this whole light emission thing and receiving that's going on outside of language, outside of everything. And I think that that's why we pick up on people's energies um too. And that's not whether even throughout different species and plants. I would imagine it's the same thing. So that's the relationship thing's got my head spinning, man. It's just kind of going in all kinds of different. I love it. I love that that was like where you went right out of the gate.
It well, yeah, it's the connection is so important, and I think going back one thing. I mean, I was thinking about these. In the when we talk about regenerative agriculture, everybody lumps on these six principles, and context is always the first, very important, right? And then when we're looking at scientific research, the first thing is called observation. And yeah, we can, if we only interpret that word thinking about observation, which is by eyesight, and Zoom would do that thing, right? Better than a phone call, better than a text message, better than email. However, I think there is deeper than that. Observation should be kind of in terms of how do we use all of our senses, right? And one example I always kind of appreciate that the experience I had was when I was teaching up at observatory on soil science ecology in the forest. And there is a group of kids who are visually impaired. And they came to, um, it's a challenging group because a lot of for our um, kind of science research project we created for them require us to hike into difficult places to sample things. And the first thing we always think about, well, if they can't see, how can they experience? It's quite the opposite. In fact, they taught me something I've never experienced is during the day, we guide them go through these hiking trails. And and then of course, you know, there's a guide in the front, there's a guide on the side, there's a guide at the back to make sure the whole group is going together. And it's the first time we developed a research project based on palpation method and to analyze lichen, to analyze moss, and then to describe the differences between them and also different speciation of the lichen, how they feel like, without seeing the color, without seeing the shape, without seeing anything. Right? That's a breakthrough already. But that night, and we kind of proposed, hey, we typically do these night hike exercise, but let's change our route and then doing a indoor exercise. And the students insist, how about this? Let us guide you guys to go hike. Literally, we went on the same hike and they guided us without any lights. Cloudy day. We complete the hike, no problem. Of course, as instructor, we have senses knowing which direction we're going, right? But it just impressed me so much is when we lose one senses, you develop so many other senses that we often don't think about. But when we think about that observation, what does that really mean is to activate our smell, taste, and listening, palpation, also maybe feeling, right? And I think that's what described what you said, that in person, that feeling, that senses, you activate all the senses to connect with each other. That is something that Zoom will never provide to us, those things. And that's the relationship I think it's a signaling effect. It's not really a how we look at it, that effect.
That's super cool. What a neat experience. That is fascinating to have visually impaired lead a, a night hike. How I mean, how like what a difference of perspective. I love that. Huh. Well, man, let's go into a little bit of your takeaway with light. So before we hit record, you were talking about a paddock John has down by the river, and he had discussed removing some trees to get more grass to grow in this certain. It's a area that's a little more prone to flooding. Uh, and you said, well, hold on, let's talk about that. So go through what your perspective is on different optics within grazing areas, with more with trees, more without. What are your takeaways as you pondered that?
Yeah, I think I first came across um there are several connections. One is when I'm looking at how livestock behavior, and of course I grazed sheep, and that's my most experience. And and there's one study suggested when there is more upper canopies, trees, which shaded the lower canopy in ways which we know that when we have that multi-storage effect and how the sunlight is being filtered, that it really block a lot of the um, blue light and certain only allow certain red light part coming through infrared. And when also when that effect is occurred, the plants actually at the lower canopy start branching out because of the infrared and green light. Those really amplify that developmental process of the plants. And equally, the plants actually become more efficient on water utility. So evapotranspiration reduce in that sense. So you create a water cycle. There is the moisture water bubble that also absorb UV light, right? So we can't ignore any of that. But particularly on this paper suggested the green light that has a help activate the animal sheep activity for become a better grazer or have extend its grazing period on that. And there's several thoughts after I read that paper. Number one is it's very well known for Japanese study they've done is how they go to the forest and then doing the
Horse
green light
bathing, yeah.
therapy, right? So that's very well known and culturally very appropriate for them, and a lot of people are doing that actually. And two is when you're changing the light spectrum when you filter a certain light spectrum out and have the UV light being reduced and infrared increased, if you're thinking about through the day, which part of the day is that? It's the morning and evening, right? And when we think about morning, when you wake up from the darkness, from overnight resting, and the first thing you go as a livestock is you go to eat. And before I go to bed, the last thing I do is let me stuff up before I go to bed, right? So that has always been the ruminant's pattern is they graze in the morning and evening in that pattern because of that the light effect I think has a fundamentally have a big impact on that. Of course, also depending on these physiological changes over the night, that digestion processing that also have effect. But we can't really ignore that light pattern of the spectrum really activate that kind of behavioral change. So for all those combinations, that's where I have hypothesized at the very beginning is, well, if we put the sheep under the trees, dense trees, like agroforestry type, and they would eat more. They would actually increase their activity. And I have actually personally observed that by putting sheep in one of these mesquite boxes, like pretty much germinated by birds, right? They will eat the seed and then kind of come back and forth and going through this field and creating the dense mesquite forest where Bermuda grass, I understand that's invasive, but that's in that ecological function where bacteria dominated soil. That's the speciation has changing its growth pattern and with less seed throughout the year to actually go through it. They don't go through that maturity anymore. They kind of keep getting more um, shoots coming out, which is tie into what the stress we talk about. There's less stress, and the plant doesn't have to go through that reproduction, right? And they kind of continue to keep themselves growing even through winter time in the arid climate like ours, and that's mesmerizing. But when you add sheep in there with all these mesquite trees shading out a lot of the sunlight, and plants already signal that, yeah, we're going to change our metabolic for our growth. And this sheep actually going back and forth, they just keep moving. Their grazing, yes, increased a little bit, but the most what I've seen is they started trampling more. They started walking more. They start nibbling more and nibbling a little bit food, but they don't graze like they go into a field in the early morning, like act so hungry anymore. They just nibbling and resting and then walk around and nibbling again. So that pattern, I've seen that through. I think it's very fascinating how the ruminants actually adjust those sunlight, adjust those environmental conditions, and go through that. So when I talked to John, I think I was asking him, hey, maybe try out to see if cattle would do the same thing in that wood, because cutting out the forest and woods and then to create more grassland, yes, that's our first instincts of how a grazer should be on the grassland. But I think sometimes those changing in behavior, giving a alternative environmental condition that will activate those the body of a metabolism on the cellular side in a different way. Um, Maybe that's something that we are yet understand, and maybe it's something that we should consider, because thinking about how we change our environment all the time for our pleasure, for our joy, for everything. Equally, I think other life choose the same way to for their lifestyle. Well, we shouldn't dictate that. We should provide those opportunity, environmental condition for them to have that experience, so we can actually observe, sense, and learn more. And the way we can treat animals, what is the animal welfare in a way, rather it's listening, right? It's looking at them and listening and understand um, what they really need rather than what we think they need.
That's fascinating. So cool. I, the you said a couple things. Got me spinning again. Different exposures to light affect mitochondria different too. Like UV light turns down ATP production. Like I would imagine in ruminants it would be similar. And so like you from that perspective, what you just said makes so much sense. You also have a shift between different metabolic processes, like glycolysis or the PPP, right? Nobody ever talks about the pentose phosphate pathway. So you also laid out an argument for the transition zones, right? From grassland to woodlands, and then in between, you typically have the savanna, right? And so that differences in metabolism based on environment, dude, that's big. That's I'm excited to ponder that more. That's fascinating.
Well, if I can add one more element in here, like degree of freedom here, to add a complexity here is, if I heard right, you always mentioned this, we should eat local, seasonal, and natural, right? And be more of a grazer during the warmer season, but be a carnivore in the wintertime. And I argue that in two ways. Number one is, think about, we are the only species on this planet don't have don't hibernate, right? And also we don't migrate, and or we don't dormant in any senses. But looking at all these other species, they do one out of these three at least. For plants, cool season plant dormant in summer, warm season, right? And warm season plant dormant in wintertime or cool season. And bison, large birds, most of the birds migrate, and bear, and a lot of these carnivore diet, cooler season, cooler part of the planet hibernate, right? And so I would say omnivores too. And so if we're really thinking about that, is we're not really doing a service to ourselves to follow either one of those instruction how a cellular biology should do. But if we're really thinking about that migration part, is these animals, mammals, animals, regardless of bird or land mammals, they travel through those different zones. And like what you described, from grassland to the savanna to the woodland, at that zones, and they at least experience that twice in a year for those transitions to adjust themselves. I think that, yes, through the time span is how long of the stretch you go experience that. How often do you go experience that? Maybe there's a science on that too. But I think in general, generally speaking, is that transition period of time for the metabolic change for a cellular biology to adapt to different things is so critical that we have long ignored that through our lifestyle change as a species, or what is become convenient rather than what is supposed to be natural, right, in a way.
Yeah. You you also just laid out the oscillation again, right? Like the oscillation between seasons of movement of environment, right, throughout the time. So one thing that I'm going to clarify on the local seasonal natural. So I think the context is extremely important on that for location, right? That's that local input. So when we look at, say, Inuit, right? That looks completely different than, say, the Maasai or the Aztec or the Mayan, or lay out a different culture throughout, North America. Iroquois, Cherokee, right? Like Choctaw. You have all these different uh, cultures and civilizations that we can pull from. The There's a vast difference in that, because we have another variable in that, which is temperature, right? So, like, I think in a temperate climate, one of the best examples is actually the bear. I think that's a beautiful, and I've been thinking about this. I'm glad you brought it up because I've been thinking about this a lot. In a temperate climate, or in a more northern temperate climate, we have uh, they do hibernate, and when you look at what's going on there, we can see the correlation between hibernation and diabetes, elevated blood sugar, right? Like, this is an antifreeze of sorts. And so when you go through this season of warm, and it is that grazing, that's what if we just look at a bear, right, and see if we can put a parallel there. They're grazing, they're fattening, they're eating all the time. That's the whole goal, right? And in the winter we are hibernating. Now humans don't hibernate, but we do experience stretches that where we take a break from that, right? So this is a more fasted state, which is akin to hibernation. It is a uh, based on that local and seasonal. Meat really is the only option, right? In winter, and so, like, that is where I come up with that guidelines of it is more of a carnivore diet in the winter, right? But it's also a time at which we embrace cold, and we also participate in fasting for most people. Because you don't kill something, you ain't eating in the winter, right? So there's there's a lot to unpack in just that conversation, and that shift from essentially you know uh oxidative phosphorylation to glycolysis to ketogenic. There's a lot there, right? That's a lot that is dictated and predicated off of the sun, light spectrum, the temperature, and location. So yeah,
Yeah, I guess you're gonna talk about fasting part. I think even, you know, um, dry fasting, right? Versus wet fasting, and that water become part of equation or not. That is also important when we think about the deuterium content in,
yeah,
right, in that,
absolutely.
like, how the mitochondria can access or distribute those energy in a way to make metabolic water. It's going to be very different through different part of the season, and or even through that faster oscillation that we man-made, that we create
Mhm.
for ourselves, and all those things I think is all related. It's fascinating, right? It's complex, and really there is no way we can talk about one thing and be so specialized in that field and to actually give a conclusion anymore, but rather this holistic approach, this holistic mindset, and taking every single part into that equation as a part of a consideration, whether that is the initial, reactant for that product you're getting, or is part of that process, the ingredients for that process, or enzyme or activation for that process. I think
Hmm.
all those parts throughout that chain of effect is all should be in consideration. And I don't think now I think if I really understand what you said there is I think looking at from the end to end that equilibrium or balance, it is not really the goal we're always trying to describe. That is what that process in between. How do we understand that process and making sure that we can actually find that long-term equilibrium and balance? That is what is more important, and particular for human health, but I think equally for ecosystem health, we're we're addressing similar things, um, uh, just different processes. Right?
Yeah. I think that's why we gotta have all the conversations within disciplines and multidisciplinary conversations to where you bring in these different perspectives. That's why I get so excited. Like one group that I just think's just fascinating is uh, Scott Zimmerman, Bob Fosbury, Robert Schalt, or Roger Schalt, and Glenn Jeffrey. So you've got a optics engineer, a biologist, a astro physicist, and a medical doctor that has like Roger's got like I don't know 5 different specialties. It's crazy what all he's done. But you get such beautiful breakthroughs in these conversations that they're having because it's so varied in their scope. And it's super cool. It's like that's why I just like these conversations. It's just like you get a completely different perspective. And again, I keep going back to the differences in culture too. I think that is a beautiful wrinkle that just adds more flavor and insight. And so I love it. I every time that we visit and we talk, it just kind of gets that mind spinning and just more comes to mind.
Yeah, yeah. I think equally in that way, I always go back to that relationship because as a steward of the land, I think everybody have that responsibility, whether you increase your purchasing power to support people who are actually on the land to store, or versus you are actually on the land to do things to make it better than before. And I think that relationship, that connection, it has to be built organic. It can be transactional, right? It can't be, yeah, I'm going to purchase something that as a part of my way to support and one off. It doesn't often work that way. What that continuity, a longevity is so important. I think as a cooperative level, what we're looking at our community here is, um, when we're looking at how do we support farmers, oftentimes in the world of regenerative agriculture, everybody say, well, let me tell you how to improve your soil biology and then use this product or that product, use this method or rather or that practice. And we're still in that lens is, okay, how do you improve your production method to get that better product, rather than asking the producer first thing, particularly mid-size and small-size producer, first thing is, how are you doing? Do you have enough market? Can you keep your light on tomorrow? That's not a joke. I mean, there's literally a lot of producers of scattered across the country cannot ensure themselves keep the light on tomorrow. And that is not something we ever talk about. And these food hubs, in my view, at each region to be able to activate, to combine all producers' produce together, enter into a larger, more accessible market, is going to have to be the way we have to outlook in a cooperative way, and to go through that process so the farmers can have the guarantee to say, yeah, I can start my crop planning for the next crop season, 6, 7 months, and I have a guarantee for this amount of dollar. So I know how much effort I put in, how much saving I can get to improve my farm, either my own skill or my infrastructure to get ready for a bigger market that I can access. So that kind of, you can't really go through that in a technical way, but through a building that relationship, building that trust, so we can look into eye to eye to each other to understand, I got your back,
Yeah.
and the other side will say the same way. And that is so critical. And I think everything become a symptom. And that, if we don't solve that part as part of the diagnosis, this whole process is always going to be ill.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big conversation too, right? Like that brings in a whole nother multiple realms of discipline or however you want to put it, too, right? There's business, there's marketing, there's logistics. We were talking about before we hit record, that's freaking hard. There's distribution. There's like this whole other level of conversation there. Just navigating the cost of compliance because of regulations, right? Like, and we go through so many of these conversations, but like that's a big one in of itself, and I think people really need to fully grasp that we are in a situation where we as Americans cannot feed ourselves. Like we can't. We cannot grow our at the current state of where we are right now. I know for Arkansas, we don't have enough producers doing the whole thing to feed Arkansas. That's really a scary. It's a national security issue, honestly. And so like there's yeah, that's a big conversation. That's another one we probably need to bring a round table together and keep doing because that's I just had AJ on and then Molly Englehart. We discussed this and it's a big deal. It's terrifying actually. But that's where I go back to we've also got to be able to focus on what it is that we can do, right? Like we can do anything, but we can't do everything. So like what is it in our role, our scope that we can execute on that contributes to that complexity that we have, hit on so many different fields, right? Like, I had attended at we're about to wrap up, but discussing C3 and C4 plants, right? Like that's a huge deal, right? Like you're talking about grazing in the mesquite, and then the first thing I thought of is like that is going to inevitably lead to a higher water table, and then what happens to mesquite? They're going to probably die. I mean, like that's your world, not as much mine, but I'm at least doing like the mental experiment in my head as you go through that, and so that completely changes the ecosystem to where we have another oscillation, right? Like so, it's just nonstop. So, anyways, I love it. I always love visiting with you, brother.
Yeah, yeah. Likewise, I think hit on. I think beyond that national security issue, I think it's a civilization security issue. I think it's not just Arkansas, it's not just Arizona. I think it's happening every single state in this country, and it happening every single continent in this whole world. Now, our international trade completely changed how our self-dependency, that kind of rhythm. Now, I think that is uh, again, I'm gonna refer to what Will Hurst, when first time went to DC, and we had a great visit with a lot of office, but that's less important. But when I walked that office, everybody said, "Hey, Yadi, you understand it's gonna take another 2 hours for you to be able to get through the security come in." I said, "I don't care. I have an elder here, and that's what I was learning in China is that respect your elders, and I highly respect what Will Harris has done for his community. I need to send him off to the cab and say goodbye to him. That's the manner, right? As a younger, you have to have." And I did that. And then the last sentence he told me is, "Yeah, you go save the world. I'm going to go back and save my community." And that just kind of really hammered me hard. I think that was the last trip I went to DC because that sentence. And two is that sentence, what he said there, and I'm continuing simmering what my father-in-law's philosophy, who brought me into agriculture arena, is the three pillars he has is family, community, and the land
Yeah.
stewardship. And those three things, I think those two things, when you tie in those together, I don't yet fully unpack and understood everything, but I'm still learning and trying to simmer the best I can. But those are powerful. And I think that really made me have that commitment, is not using any social network like Instagram or
Yeah.
whatever, right? But rooted in, if I can see my neighbor, if I can see people in my community eye to eye, and to make small changes, that is more tangible. That is more coherent. That is more, I think, therapeutic. That relationship is stronger than anything. That's how I felt when you said that. And we can only do that much. What is our focus is. And I think it's really tied into all these elders who share those philosophy, right? Including my parents taught me, do something good for society. How bold is that? And I'm still trying to understand, what does that even mean, right? And it's the continual journey of learning, self-education, an evolving process. That's what regeneration is about, is the evolving process. And it's that process is not the end result. We'll probably never reach that end result if there's so many different steps to go there. And that's the journey of life in general.
I love it, my friend. I love it. Well, I think everything that we have discussed kind of goes into like what my you know goal is creating a prosperity zone as an example to be able to do all over, right? Like this, those hubs are different words for it, but like cure cancer, grow food, build relationships. I love it.
Yeah.
Thanks, brother.
Well, thank you.